First thing Ryu Ihara noticed about his rookies was that none of them had ever been afraid before. Not really afraid. Not the kind that lives in your sternum and makes your hands clumsy on a control panel at 3 in the morning. They were brave enough. He'd give them that. They were talented, obedient, composed under pressure. They wore their guise patches, with the careful pride of people who had earned something and knew it. But there was a quality missing from their eyes that Ryu had seen in the eyes of his former crew, the people he'd fought alongside during the Dark Year. When alien Emperor had turned his gaze toward Earth and the sky above Tokyo had cracked open, like an eggshell, his rookies were competent soldiers. His old crew had been something else. He didn't have a clean word for it. He was thinking about this while the briefing played out on the main screen. Commander Sakamizu's voice calm and methodical, as always. The kind of voice that could tell you the world was ending and make it sound like a scheduling matter. Ryu had his arms folded. He was watching the faces of his team rather than the screen. Salamandora is confirmed neutralized, Sakamizu said. We've got 3 more signatures inside the 40-kilometer zone. Roboruga over the bay, Mukadender at grid 77, and Kelbim is moving up the coastal ridge. We'll split and address them simultaneously. One of the rookies, Harazaki, 22 years old, sharp reflexes, laughed too loud at his own jokes, raised his hand. Sir, what's generating these incursions? The Emperor's been dead 8 months. That's what we're going to find out, Sakamizu said, which was not actually an answer, and the fact that Harazaki didn't push back told Ryu something about the quality of the young man's instincts. A good soldier accepted the mission. An excellent soldier understood when the people giving orders were also uncertain. Ryu took Mukadender. It was the kind of fight that had become almost mechanical to him. The precise angles of approach, the way you threaded the ship through the creature's strike radius, the sequence of fire that peeled its armor. He knew the language of these engagements, the way a surgeon knows the language of the body. His rookies were competent. They followed his lead. They didn't hesitate. What they didn't do was anticipate. There was a moment midway through the engagement when Mukadender shifted its weight in a particular way that Ryu recognized. A telegraphed pivot, a secondary mouth opening on its left flank. His old crew would have read it before his hand reached the controls. Yuki would have already banked. George would have been calling the angle. Nomi would have been adjusting the shields. Instead, Ryu had to bark the order, and by the time it processed, taken a glancing hit that rattled the ship and left a smell like burning insulation threading through the cabin. Nobody panicked. That was something. Mukadender went down. Ryu reported in, got confirmation that Roboruga and Kelbim were being handled. He was letting himself exhale when the fireball appeared. It materialized off the port side. Not an explosion, not a weapon discharge, but a sphere of something that was not quite fire and not quite light, hanging in the air with a patience that living things rarely demonstrated. Ryu stared at it for 3 seconds. Haruzaki in the co-pilot seat had gone very quiet. Sir, Haruzaki said, I see it. The ship lurched, not from impact, from something else, something that bypassed physics in a way Ryu couldn't articulate, as though the space around the vessel simply decided to relocate. There was a sensation like falling sideways, a compression behind the eyes, and then the world outside the viewport was different. The sky was gone, the city below was gone. In their place was a chamber of metal so vast that the far walls were invisible, lit by sources Ryu couldn't identify, filled with a silence that had a texture to it, like the air in a cathedral or a tomb. Haruzaki was shaking, not visibly, just a faint tremor in his hands on the controls, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. Ryu recognized it because he'd felt the same thing himself a long time ago, the first time the sky had gone wrong. Steady, Ryu said. Where are we? Ryu looked at the readouts, which were mostly useless. He looked at the metal walls, ancient and massive, riveted with fixtures that suggested engineering of a scale. His mind kept sliding off. He thought about the intelligence reports he'd read, the ones that talked about alien Emperor's vessel, the ship called Darkness Fear that the Emperor had ridden to Earth like a man rides a horse to war. Inside it, Ryu said. We're inside his ship. Haruzaki absorbed this without speaking. Then he said, he's been dead for 8 months. Yes, so why is his ship? The trident came through the hull from outside like a needle through paper. Ryu had fast reflexes. He'd been in combat for years. He'd trained until training became reflex, and reflex became something closer to instinct. None of it was fast enough. Projectile. Massive, three-pronged, covered in sigils that hurt to look at directly. Punched through the ship's side, missed him by perhaps half a meter, and struck the control board with a sound that was less an explosion and more a termination. Systems died in sequence. The emergency lighting flickered red. Haruzaki was already at the emergency panel. Ryu's hands moved without instruction, sealing bulkheads, redirecting power. They worked in silence, efficiently. The way people who have trained together learn to share a crisis without narrating it. Then the thing appeared. It was the size of a building. That was the first thing Ryu registered. Because the human brain has to start somewhere when confronted with scale it was not designed to process. Samurai armor. That was the second thing, the cultural shorthand his mind reached for. Because the shape was vaguely humanoid and plated in black lacquer over dark metal, with a helmet styled like a kabuto, but vast, the face of it smooth and eyeless, and somehow still watching. It moved with a deliberateness that was more frightening than speed, the way a glacier moves, indifferent to any urgency you might bring to the encounter. Ryu was a rational man. He did not believe in the supernatural. He had fought monsters and aliens and creatures that defied every classification his education had prepared him for, and he had done it without losing his grip on what was real. But looking at the armored giant through the cracked viewport, he felt something that was harder to classify than fear. Something more like the recognition of a weight that couldn't be moved. "Haruzaki," he said quietly. "Get out." "Sir, that's an order." Haruzaki went, because he was a good soldier. Ryu stayed because he was Ryu Aihara, and there were some kinds of standing ground that you didn't abandon even when you couldn't explain why. The ship's emergency beacon was still transmitting. He watched the armored figure outside the hull, moving with that glacial patience, and he ran the math on his situation, and the math was not encouraging. But Ryu had been in situations where the math was not encouraging before, and what he'd learned was that math only counted the variables it could see. The thing fired. The discharge was a deep crimson beam, the color of old dried blood, and it hit the ship broadside with a force that threw Ryu against the far wall. He came back to consciousness faster than he had any right to, a half second, maybe less, because some survival mechanism overrode the shock. Tasted copper. The ship was coming apart around him in slow, deliberate pieces. He thought about Mirai. He thought about George and Konomi and Yuki and Teppei and Marina, about the way they used to crowd into the break room after a bad engagement, and someone would always produce food from somewhere, real food, inexplicable quantities of it, because humans apparently responded to danger by feeding each other. He thought about Sakomizu's hand on his shoulder after the Emperor's defeat, just resting there, not saying anything. He thought, if I'm going to die in a dead Emperor's ship, I'm going to do it standing up. He stood up. And then something happened that he could not account for. A wave of force hit the armored giant from outside. Not from his ship, not from any weapon he recognized. It struck the massive figure in the chest and actually staggered it, actually made it pause. Nothing had done since it appeared. Ryu found a handhold and looked through the largest gap in the hull. Standing outside, glowing with a cold blue-white light that hurt to look at and was somehow also beautiful, was a figure Ryu knew. Ultraman Mebius, Mirai Hibino, who had been a raw recruit once, a boy from the sky who had worn a guy's uniform with such earnest determination that the older crew had alternately wanted to adopt him and protect him from himself. Who had fought with them through the worst year in living memory and had gotten hurt doing it, badly, repeatedly, and had never once stopped trying. Mirai Hibino, who had gone home to the stars 8 months ago, and who was here now, which meant something had called him back, and that something was not anything Ryu wanted to think too carefully about. Mebius fought the armored giant with everything he had. Ryu watched it from the wreckage of his ship, unable to do anything useful. What he saw over the next several minutes was the thing that kept him honest about his own courage. Even at full power, even with the light blazing off his form, Mebius was losing. Not panicking, not retreating, but losing. The armored giant absorbed every blow, turned them with interest. Fired that deep crimson ray again and again, and each time it connected, Mebius was slower to recover. The light dimmed slightly. The movements became less fluid. The giant raised its weapon for a finishing strike. A second wave hit it from the flank, and a second light appeared. Ultraman Hikari, ice blue and precise, who had apparently also received whatever message had called them here. Two of them. Two Ultras fighting the armored giant, and the giant was still winning, still grinding them down with impatience that was not cruelty, not malice, but something colder, inevitability. The absolute certainty of a thing that cannot be stopped. Mebius was on one knee. The light of him was flickering. Ryu made a decision. He found a section of hull that was more intact than the rest, and he sat down in it, and he breathed through his nose, the way Sakamizu had once taught him to breathe before a hard insertion, slow and even, pushing the fear down to somewhere manageable. He looked at his hands, which were shaking slightly, and he watched them until they stopped. Then he got on the communicator that somehow still worked. Emergency frequency, broadcasting blind, and he said, "This is Captain Ihara. I'm alive." Sitrep needed. The response came from Harazaki, who was also somehow alive, who had found a way to survive the evacuation that Ryu had not supervised closely enough to worry about until now, and whose voice was shaking in a way that his hands had merely trembled. "Sir, Mebius is down. Hikari is. I don't know. The armor is still moving." "Tation?" Sir, you're inside the ship. I'm outside." "Hikari?" A pause. "I think Hikari went into it. Into the armor." Ryu sat with that for a moment. An ultra warrior, trapped inside a suit of alien armor, imprisoned in the very thing he'd been trying to fight. He thought about what that would feel like from the inside. All that light, all that power, contained and weaponized, used against everything you'd sworn to protect. "Haruzaki," he said, "I need you to get me a precise location on the structural weak point in this helmet." Another pause. "Sir, the armor it's the size of a building. You can't." "I know what I can't do," Ryu said. "Tell me where the weak point is." There was a longer pause, and then Harazaki said something that Ryu had not expected. "I need to run the scan. Give me 2 minutes." 2 minutes. Ryu used them to breathe, and to think about what kind of person you had to be to get inside a dead Emperor's ship and crack open a suit of armor the size of a skyscraper, with your bare hands and a damaged guy's craft. He did not conclude that he was that person. He concluded that he did not have a better option, which was different. He also used those 2 minutes to notice that the fighting outside had slowed, because it was over. The armored giant was still there, massive in station, but because something had shifted. Mebius was recovering slowly, drawing on reserves that shouldn't have existed. And there was something different about the giant's movements. Subtler, barely perceptible hesitation in its strikes. Hikari, he thought, still fighting from inside. When Harazaki came back on, he had the location. A fracture point in the upper section of the helmet, where the joining of two ancient metal plates had been stressed by Hikari's attempts to break free. From the inside it would have been invisible. From the outside, in the right light, it showed as a seam. "There's a maintenance corridor in the upper forward section," Ryu said, because he had been exploring the ship while he waited. Because Ryu Ihara did not sit still when there was something to be learned. "I can get there." "Sir, the armor is moving. If you're inside when?" "I know," he said. "Stop arguing and guide me." Harazaki guided him. The maintenance corridor was never meant for human anatomy, and Ryu was not a small man. He moved through it in the way that soldiers learn to move through spaces that want to kill them. Methodically, low, reading each handhold before committing weight. The metal groaned around him. The ship shuddered as the battle outside shifted and the giant moved. He kept going. He thought about the old crew. Not sentimentally, practically. He thought about what George would have done in this corridor. George, with his ridiculous confidence, and his actual genuine skill that backed up every bit of the confidence. He thought about Yuki's way of reading a situation in silence and then moving on it before anyone else had finished analyzing. Thought about Teppei explaining the technical aspects of whatever they were facing in exact detail at the worst possible moment, and how that detail, irritating as the timing always was, had saved them more than once, he thought. "I am the sum of everyone I have fought beside." That's what the Emperor never understood. You can destroy a soldier, You cannot destroy the shape that soldier has left in the people around them. Corridor opened into a space just large enough to stand, and above him, a gap in the plating that the giant's own struggles against its prisoner had widened. He could see the seam. Ryu looked at his hands. Then he started climbing. The giant moved. The world lurched. He held on with a grip that left his palms raw against the metal edges. And he waited for the motion to stabilize, and he climbed some more. Below him, or around him, or in whatever direction outside's meant from inside a pocket dimension, inside a dead Emperor's ship, he could hear the fight. Feel it through the metal. The impacts, the energy discharges, the specific vibration of Mebius, fighting through exhaustion to protect something he believed in. Ryu had watched Mirai Hibino choose to stay on Earth once, at the cost of everything, because he thought humans were worth choosing. The memory of that was a physical thing. Somewhere in his chest, he reached the seam. It was wider than he'd expected. Hikari had been working on it from inside, not breaking through, but weakening, slowly, in the brief windows when he could act before the armor reasserted control. The metal here was stressed and delaminated, the ancient bonding between plates, partly undone by an ultra-warrior who had never stopped fighting even while imprisoned. Ryu wedged his hands into the gap. He was not strong enough to open it, he knew that. He wasn't under any illusions about what a human being in a guy's uniform could accomplish against alien engineering that had withstood all ultra-warriors. He pulled anyway, with everything he had. Legs braced against the hull behind him, whole body committed to an act that was rational only, if you defined rational as doing what needed to be done regardless of the odds. The metal moved. Not much. A millimeter, maybe. But it moved, and when it did, there was a change in what was happening inside the armor. Something released. Something that had been held at the edge of its capacity found a fraction more room. And the pale blue-white light that leaked through the gap intensified. "Haruzaki," Ryu said through gritted teeth, still pulling. "Are you seeing this?" "I'm seeing it," Haruzaki said. His voice had changed. The shaking was gone. In its place was something Ryu recognized. The particular quality of focus that people develop when they realize the thing they... "Tell Mebius," Ryu said. He didn't know if Haruzaki could reach Mebius. He didn't know if it would matter. He kept pulling. The light came through in a rush. Hikari broke free the way a dam breaks. Not gradually, but all at once. A release of everything that had been held. The force of it threw Ryu backward through the corridor. And he hit 3 things on the way and didn't feel any of them until much later. And then the armored giant outside was staggering. Actually staggering. Because the thing that had been parasitizing its power was gone, pulled free like a splinter from a wound. And the giant that had seemed inevitable was suddenly just a very large suit of armor with a gap in its helmet and no prisoner left to weaponize. Ryu found a viewport. Mebius had the sword. He didn't know how. Haruzaki filled in that detail later, voice still carrying that new quality of focus. Hikari had been carrying a blade when the armor consumed him, and when he broke free, the blade had been the first thing Mebius reached for, and the armor had been stunned long enough for one swing, one clean swing, and what Mebius possessed that the armored giant did not, was not power, not size, but the understanding that one moment, used correctly, was enough. The blade connected. The armor froze. Ryu watched it happen from inside the shuddering metal of the dead Emperor's ship. The giant that had moved with the patience of geological time suddenly became, in one instant, a statue. The light in its frame went to something other than light. The sense of inevitability that had pressed down on the entire engagement evaporated like mist. He sat there for a moment, breathing. Then he said into the communicator, "Haruzaki, status." Haruzaki's voice came back immediately. "Is petrified, sir. Mebius is down." He transformed back. "I think it's okay." Hikari also informed me, "Sir." He looks exhausted. He could barely stand up. Ryu thought about the inside of the armor. About what it would have been like to be Hikari in there, fighting without any way to win, not stopping. "He didn't stop," Ryu said. "No, sir, he didn't stop." The ship groaned around him. The pocket dimension was becoming unstable. He could feel it in the way the metal was behaving, in small wrongnesses he couldn't name, but could identify by long experience as the specific wrongness of a situation about to change, rapidly. He started moving toward the exit, toward where the hull breach was. toward any way out that didn't involve being inside an ancient alien warship. When the laws of physics finished remembering that they applied here too, he found Haruzaki outside the ship, outside the darkness sphere, standing in a way that Ryu hadn't seen before from his rookies, not rigid with military discipline, but loose, limbed, present, the stance of someone who has been through something and come out changed by it. Zaki looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You went in there." "Yes." "You climbed up the inside of his helmet." "Yes." Zaki processed this. "Sir," he said finally, "that was either incredibly brave or completely crazy." "Usually the same thing," Ryu said. The others were arriving now, the older crew, the ones Sakamizu had assembled, Yuki and George and Konomi and Teppei, who had come out of whatever lives they'd built in the 8 months since the war, and answered the call. Because there are some calls that you answer, regardless of what you've built around yourself in the meantime. They came in fast, with the specific competence of people who had done this before, and when they saw Ryu, there was a moment brief, unspoken, of the kind of communication that requires no words. Mirai found them. He was in his human form, which was the form Ryu had always known him in, through the form that moved through Guy's headquarters with that earnest determination. And he looked exhausted in a way that was also peaceful. The exhaustion of a person who has spent everything on something worth spending on. He looked at Ryu, and then at Haruzaki, and then at the older crew, and he didn't say anything that would have sounded right, written down. What he said was, "You're all here." "Where else?" said, which was not a question. The darkness sphere was moving, not gone, still vast, still ancient, still a problem, but moving differently now, threat recalibrated. Hikari, back in Ultra form, had made the decision that Ryu would have made. The ship needed to be drawn away, contained, handled in a place where human collateral damage was not a factor. The land of light, where technology matched the scale of the problem. They stood and watched him go. The sky over what was left of the area was the particular shade of blue that follows weather, when the air has been through something. Ryu had seen that sky many times. It never stopped being the specific color of aftermath. "We need to file the engagement report," Yuki said, because Yuki had always been the one who remembered that operations have paperwork. "I know," Ryu said. "The rookies did well," George said. Ryu thought about this. He thought about Haruzaki guiding him through the maintenance corridor, with a voice that had stopped shaking. He thought about the precise scan, 2 minutes, the location that had made everything else possible. "They did," he said. "They're going to be good." "Better than we were?" Konomi asked, which was the question that was always lurking behind this kind of conversation. Ryu thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about things. He thought about Haruzaki's face when it stopped being afraid. Not when the danger passed, but when he decided what to do about the danger. That specific moment, that transition. Different, he said. The same way we were different from the people before us. He looked at Mirai, who was standing slightly apart from the group, tilted up toward the sky the way he often was, when he thought no one was watching, like he was listening for something on a frequency the rest of them couldn't tune to. A young man from the stars who had chosen to stay on Earth came back when it needed him, who had held on through something that should have broken him and struck when the moment opened. There was a sign, sometimes in the sky, an ultra sign. Mirai had explained it once, badly, in the tentative way he explained things he found difficult to translate. A signal from the land of light, permission, or acknowledgement, or just contact. Mirai looked at it and something in his face shifted, and he laughed a little. The surprised laugh of someone who wasn't expecting good news. "What does it say?" Haruzaki asked. He'd drifted over without anyone noticing, and he was looking at the same sky, seeing nothing but sky, which was the human condition. "That I can stay," Mirai said. "A little longer." Ryu looked at him. Then he looked at Haruzaki, who was working out some set of feelings too complicated for his face to contain all at once, the way young people do when something confirms a belief they didn't know they'd formed. Sakomizu, on the comm, was asking for the engagement report. Toriyama's voice could be heard in the background, officious and slightly panicked, which meant that he had received some preliminary intelligence about what had actually happened, and was in the process of revising his bureaucratic model of acceptable outcomes. Ryu started walking back toward the transport. "Haruzaki," he said. "Sir, you did well in there." Haruzaki was quiet for a moment, then, "I didn't do much, sir." "You did exactly what was needed," Ryu said. "That's usually more than enough." They walked, the whole group of them, old crew and new, Mirai falling in beside Ryu the way he always had, matching his stride. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the metal ruins of the area, picking out edges, casting long, clean shadows, the kind of light that makes damaged things look less like wreckage and more like evidence that something was fought for. Ryu was not a sentimental man, but he was a man who paid attention, and what he paid attention to in that moment was this: the people around him, walking through the aftermath of something that should have ended them. Talking, and not talking in the way of people who have learned to be in the same space without needing to fill it. The rookies drifting closer to the old crew, unconsciously, the way that proximity to experience is also a kind of learning. The armored darkness had come with a dead emperor's plan, a contingency written into the deep architecture of an alien empire, designed to activate at the moment of failure and carry forward the logic of destruction into whatever came after. It had been inevitable in the way that legacies of power are inevitable. Not because they cannot be stopped, because stopping them requires exactly the thing that power assumes you don't have. What you need, Ryu thought, is not a bigger weapon, or a stronger armor, or a more powerful beam. What you need is someone who will climb up the inside of the problem and wedge their hands into the gap and hold on, and trust that holding on is enough to give the people fighting on the outside the one moment they need. He'd read that the armor was called Armored Darkness, the legacy of destruction. The Emperor's Plan B. He looked at the sky. Was still that particular aftermath blue, and at the people walking with him, and at Mirai beside him with his face tilted toward something only he could hear. Plan B, Ryu thought. Against this, he almost felt sorry for the Empire, almost. When the engagement report was filed the next morning, cleaned up, formatted, to fit the boxes that Toriyama's bureaucracy required, it listed the engagement outcome as threat neutralized, personnel all accounted for, significant assets lost within acceptable parameters. What the report did not capture, because reports are not built to capture such things, was the specific look on Harazaki's face when the scan came back, and he understood that he had found the weakness in something vast and armored, and seemingly inevitable, and that the information was in his hands, and that what he did with it would matter. That moment of a person realizing that the skills they have been building, for reasons they cannot always articulate, are the exact shape of what is needed. The report did not capture Ryu's hands, raw from alien metal, steady by the time they reached the transport. It did not capture the way the old crew had shown up. Not because they were ordered to. Because some calls you answer regardless. Because you are the sum of everyone you have fought beside. And that sum does not dissolve when the emergency is declared over. It did not capture Mirai laughing at the sky. These things happened anyway, recorded or not, because that is the nature of the things that matter. They persist in the people who were there. They shape the next engagement, and the one after that, and the capacity of the people who inherit the problem when the veterans eventually step back. The Empire had sent its darkness, its armor, its legacy, its plan written in the moments before defeat. The cold logic of destruction that says, if I cannot win, I will ensure that winning costs everything. It had not counted on the particular human arithmetic of people who answer calls they are not required. Answer. Who hold on when the holding is all that's possible. Who find the gap in what seems invulnerable and wedge their hands in and hold. That arithmetic, unlike the armor, was not petrified. It was still moving, still adding up, still accumulating in the people who had been there and the people those people would teach. Haruzaki would be a captain someday. Ryu was sure of it. Sure. The way you're sure of things that you can see clearly, because you've been in the shape of them yourself. He would take his own crew into situations that shouldn't be survivable, and he would look at his hands until they stopped shaking. He would climb. Because that's what humans do. Not because they're the strongest, or the fastest, or the most armored against the dark. Because they don't stop. Because when the dead emperor sends his legacy forward, his final weapon, his contingency against hope, they climb inside it and they break it open from within, and then they file the report, and then they go home, and then they come back when it's needed. That is the legacy that does not end.